A targeted supply chain attack against Chrome browser extensions, an analysis of a critical authentication bypass vulnerability in Fortinet security appliances. This is Nest News Review Episode 2. Now, what can I change? Welcome back. This is Episode 2 of the Nest News Review. Today's first story comes from Quentin Borg and the Threat Detection and Research Team over at Sequoia and looks at a targeted supply chain attack against Chrome browser extensions. The attack was first discovered after it affected the Chrome browser extension produced by a security company. The attackers managed to gain access to the account of a developer of this Chrome extension by phishing his credentials. After that, the attackers added malicious code to the extension and uploaded the modified extension to the Google Chrome Web Store. An investigation by the team at Sequoia determined that a dozen Chrome extensions had been compromised by the attacker, potentially affecting hundreds of thousands of end users. Stories about browser extensions behaving in unexpected ways frequently make cybersecurity news. A recent deep dive analysis by John Tuckner at SecureAnnex looks at another case. The concept of a supply chain compromise has captured many cybersecurity headlines, but similar analogies exist in other sectors. For example, imagine a restaurant that sources stock from different suppliers. It needs to ensure that the raw ingredients that it is sourcing are not contaminated. Or car manufacturing, where parts are sourced from a variety of smaller companies. The car manufacturer needs to inspect the manufacturing facilities used by its suppliers, conduct spot checks, and ensure compliance to security standards to ultimately avoid faulty parts or parts that may have been tampered with for making their way into a car. The same is true for software. Now, who are these articles for? Looking at our 5x5 relevancy matrix, I'm calling it VAFA's relevancy matrix, or VRM for short. We see that these articles are primarily relevant to security teams, and they can also apply to technically minded CISOs. So what can you do? If you're a member of the security team, the obvious first step is to check through the IOCs provided in the article, feed them through your SIEM, and see if you have any matches. A follow-up step is to see how you can reduce that risk going forward. The most effective measure is to reduce or even eliminate third-party browser extensions that are deployed in your organization and enforce that control centrally, for example, through GPOs or Intune. If your staff require third-party Chrome extensions for their work, then consider separating the browser on which daily web browsing takes place from an enterprise browser, which is used for business functions and which has limited access to the internet. In this way, you can reduce your exposure or vulnerability surface. The company, Island, is leading the field of enterprise browsers, allowing an organization to deploy their browser with very granular controls. Other vendors, including Microsoft, are trying to catch up, but Island has a head start. If you are a CISO, you may want to have a discussion with your team about the risk that browser extensions pose in your organization. Do your current controls allow anyone to install any browser extension and inadvertently expose the organization to malicious threat actors? Or are there some controls in place already? What is the security team's level of comfort with the current controls? Are they confident that a penetration tester would not be able to convince employees to install a malicious extension and use that to obtain credentials? Or is there room for the browser controls to be improved? You may also want to discuss with your peers in the organization and float the idea of adopting an enterprise browser to determine what is the level of effort required to test business applications on a new browser, and what is the potential impact that your peers are concerned about. The advice for individual users remains the same. Weigh carefully whether you need browser extensions at all. They are seldom essential. Whenever you get a chance, check the list of extensions you have installed. In Chrome, for example, you do this by entering Chrome://extensions and look through the extensions that are installed in your browser. Do you expect them all to be there? Do you have a need for all of them? Do you have a need for any of them? Are the developers of those extensions relatively well-known companies? When was the last time the extensions were updated by the developer? What do user reviews say about those extensions? Moving on, The second story comes from Sunny and Elise Hammond over at Watchtower Labs and is an analysis of a recent critical authentication bypass vulnerability in Fortinet security appliances. The report is a deep dive into the vulnerability and explores how it is exploited by attackers to gain superadmin access on FortiGates, effectively enabling unauthorized parties to have complete control over the affected systems. The write-up walks through specific weaknesses in the authentication mechanism that were exploited. The article is a fascinating read and closes with a GitHub link to proof of concept code. So, who is this article most relevant to? What does VAFA's relevancy matrix or VRM say? Scoring shows that this article is primarily useful to security teams and technically minded CISOs. However, following closely is a government and policy audience. What can you, as a member of a security team, do? Depending on your scope of influence, all you may be able to do is keep patching your appliances. But you may also want to look at comparative analyses between different security appliance vendors, focusing on factors like vulnerability history and patching cadence, transparency and accuracy in security advisories, and adoption of Secure Development Lifecycle (SDLC), among others. You can take this type of comparative analysis to your CISO, showing, for example, an increase in the number of critical vulnerabilities or the presence or absence of concrete steps by the security appliance vendor, describing how they are investing in modernizing their code base. You can accompany this analysis with a recommendation that the security team can confidently support. Of course, make sure that you have data to show that your team's patching process is up to standard, that you consistently patch your security appliances shortly after a patch is released by the vendor. The message you want to clarify for your CISO is whether or not, despite your team's best efforts, the risk to the organization remains high and whether it can be reduced by choosing a security appliance vendor with a better track record. If you're a CISO, this article is certainly an interesting read, especially if you come from a technical background and enjoy the detail behind vulnerabilities. If you look at this article in the context of a seemingly never-ending string of reports relating to a couple of vendors, highlighting 0 days or critical vulnerabilities in their products, then you can spot a recurring pattern. The question is whether you're comfortable with this recurring pattern or if you feel there is enough there to affect some change and replace one vendor's appliances by another. There is a common pitfall or logical trap that this conversation gets caught up in, which floats the sentiment that all vendors will have security vulnerabilities in their products, and that therefore, there's no point in going through the painful exercise of migrating from one to another, having to retrain security staff, and otherwise inconveniencing the organization. No doubt you have good responses for this line of logic, like reframing the conversation to assess the question from a neutral viewpoint, with the aim of identifying the objective truth, based on available and verifiable facts. For example, has the vendor been open about security incidents, mitigations, and root cause analyses? Does the vendor use secure coding practices? If you track the number of critical and high-severity vulnerabilities over time, what picture starts to emerge? Look for trends. Does the number of vulnerabilities increase or decrease? Are patches timely or delayed? Ultimately, you need to translate this into the language of risk for the organization. How does the track record of your current vendor increase or reduce the organization's operational risk, or financial risk, or reputational risk? What is the feedback from your peers and other organizations who have deployed equipment from the same vendor or from other vendors? Finally, for the government and policy audience, although this article is fairly detailed, you may want to zoom out and examine the track record of security vendors, focusing on cases where recurring product vulnerabilities have led to financial losses for customers, and then determine what is the appetite for enacting or enforcing regulatory actions that protect customers who can prove that they took reasonable steps to protect their organizations from a breach, but were nevertheless affected and sustained financial impact as a result. What incentives currently exist for security vendors to improve their products? Are customers rewarding more mature vendors? What trajectory does the data show? Are existing penalties leading to improved security practices, or are the same violations repeating? What are some observable unintended consequences of regulatory actions in places where they have been implemented? That's it. That was episode 2. I am Vafadario Izadinia. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed preparing it. Nest Radio is an initiative that uses AI-generated voice to share cybersecurity stories and discussions in spoken form with listeners in different languages. If you have suggestions for stories you would like to see covered or questions to explore further, drop me a note at nestradio.net. If you like this content, tell your friends. And remember, stay curious